Few tales are told of Hades, whose very name inspires fear and penitence, reminding us of the inevitable fate which we all share. I, however, mean to tell you such a tale. Listen carefully.
It's in the blood. It's in the
Hello everyone and welcome to The Perfect Sauce, a series where I try to escape from the depths of Hades itself, only to realize that I never really wanted to leave in the first place. Aww. Today's video is on Supergiant's Hades, fully released in 2020. Now, if you've been around for a while, the developer's studio name, Supergiant, should ring a bell. I distinctly remember the game Bastion from more than a decade ago. It was a frantic RPG presented from an isometric perspective, with a really unique storytelling style and beautifully crafted environments. It was incredibly successful, and what I found amazing in researching back the origins of this development studio is that this was actually their first game. Sure, they were previously working under Electronic Arts, but the fact that their very first independent game was such a hit proves that they knew what they were doing. In the years that followed, Supergiant also released Transistor, a game in the same spirit as Bastion, and Pyre, which is a more unique gameplay experience and somewhat of a break from the previous two games. But then, Hades came along. Hades represents Supergiant's finesse in years and years of designing games of the same genre as Bastion and Transistor, a perfection of the gameplay formula that made these two previous games be critically acclaimed in the indie sphere. It's a frantic isometric roguelike that uses Greek mythology as heavy inspiration to craft its own world and create characters and circumstances that are engaging. It's a dungeon crawler that relies heavily on randomizing many gameplay elements to give you unique experiences and make you hungry for more. And oh boy, have I ever been so hungry. I've obtained every trophy Hades has to offer in preparation for this breakdown, at the end of which I'll be ranking it in one of 5 categories based on my overall experience. Naturally, I'll be talking extensively about its writing, design, and gameplay, so this serves as a spoiler warning if you still want to pick up the game. So with that being said, welcome to The Perfect Sauce. Let's go over Hades' main gameplay loop. You play as Zagreus, son of Hades and prince of the Underworld. Your main goal is to escape the Underworld itself, which is split into 4 overall regions: the depths of Tartarus, the fiery rivers of Asphodel, the fields of Elysium, and the Temple of Styx. Each environment is unique, with its own set of enemies, traps, and encounters. You navigate these areas by going through several rooms, getting rewards and upgrades till you encounter the boss of the area. That's the main gist of the game, and I realize now after playing the game how ridiculously reductive this is as a summary. Because there's so much more to Hades than this. There's layers of gameplay complexities, fantastic and interconnected writing. It's genuinely a hard thing to decide where to start because there's a lot of things worth talking about. Let's go to the very beginning. The game starts you out at the beginning of an escape attempt. There is no real tutorial in the traditional sense. There's no guiding prompts or anything. Instead, you're thrown straight into the action to get a feel for how you control Zagreus and get acquainted with the gameplay loop. It's a bit disorienting at first, but the controls are quite easy to pick up, and dying is not inherently punishing. In fact, it's a main component of the gameplay loop. It's likely you'll die not too far into your first run anyway, and this is important because the game needs to teach you that dying is alright. It's crucial to advancing, and it can only make you stronger. Now, during this first run, you'll learn some of Zagreus' moveset options: basic attacks, specials, ranged casts, and dodging, all of which you can experiment with your default weapon, the Stygian Blade, a short-ranged weapon with a nice AoE special attack. In this first exploration of Tartarus, and maybe even beyond, you'll come across upgrades, boons, and gold, stuff that you basically use during your runs, but also some other things that you'll not know how to use just yet. Nonetheless, you'll eventually fall and be beckoned back to the House of Hades.
Damn it.
I'm home.
The House of Hades is your hub area, and the first time you visit it, you'll get a small taste of the game's character interactions and get to see what some items are used for. Now this hub area I really enjoy, because it's the first instance of Hades putting a unique spin on Greek mythology. It's not just your regular depiction of the underworld. Instead, it's more of a bureaucratic body that makes decisions in managing the ever-increasing civilization of undead denizens. Hades himself will be at his desk, and sometimes Shades will queue up with requests that he denies or accepts. It's not just a funny interaction that makes the world feel quote-unquote alive, but a characterization piece that shows Hades to be a father consumed by his work. And just as well, there are other Shades and immortal characters that fit different functions within this house. Hypnos, for example, is the one who greets the new undead arrivals and tracks them on a list. And that is as ironic as it is funny, because Hypnos is the personification of sleep. He'll frequently be asleep on the job and only wake up in a panic as you approach him. And there's many other such characters, some that you even encounter on your escape attempts.
Hey, what's that you're drinking, Meg? Anything good?
Whatever it is, it's weak. Enough to be mistaken for your blood.
Work, Diva.
I think this is incredibly smart. It's a unique perspective that the game uses to humanize these characters in your eyes and make your interactions with them engaging. Now let's go back to talking about the items you encounter in your runs. We can essentially separate them into two categories. The first are things that are exclusively useful during a run, like boons, upgrades, coins, or Minotaur hearts, the things that increase your HP. The other items are, for the most part, used in the House of Hades itself. Darkness lets you get and upgrade passive perks, Keys lets you unlock more perks or weapons, Nectar lets you raise relationships with other characters, and Marbles will eventually let you carry out construction orders, which you can use to customize the house's appearance or add more things you encounter in your runs. Essentially, what you get in a run lets you interact with mechanics in the hub to make future runs better or develop the narrative. This is the main loop of the game, described in the most bare bones way possible. Now let's try to talk about the main aspects of the game sequentially, which I will confess I found it quite difficult because of how these things interact. You see, Hades isn't just a straightforward roguelike dungeon crawler, it's an experience with many tangled facets to it. Many facets of this game interact with one another constantly, and untangling this game is challenging, but shows why Hades has been such a success. Let's start from a basic level and talk about the visual design of Hades by looking at the regions of the underworld you'll be exploring. The artwork you'll be seeing in the environments and characters is all hand-drawn, which is quite similar in circumstance to Bastion, but not in substance. If you were to put these two games side by side, Bastion would surely look good despite its age, but Hades has a level of polish and detail that far surpasses it. If we take a look at the environment, I feel that no matter where you look, there's always something that visually catches your attention. And that's because the level of detail doesn't just stop at, oh, let's put some cracks in this brick here, but it's about showering every stage you might come across in visual props and characteristic flair. Let's start at the lowest level of the underworld, Tartarus. In Greek mythology, Tartarus is a place meant to imprison and torment the most wicked of the dead, while also being a prison to the Titans. In-game, Tartarus very much represents that, being a prison of sorts that features many details of disrepair and symbols of the House of Hades within the playable area. But outside of the playable area, there's a lot of really cool visual cues. There's Hades' own visage on walls to signify that he's always watching, and he literally does because he'll interact with you and comment on your escape attempts.
Hurry up then, and I shall see you outside.
There's also undead shades and structures watching down on you, and gigantic hands reaching out, which I take it to represent the idea of titans being imprisoned here in these depths. Every section of a room, whether playable or not, is overlaid in such environmental detail that pays homage to its mythological source material. And let's be honest, they could have sold this background scenery by just making, for instance, a big river, or just doing much less. But they didn't. They said, let's add a huge ant here, some submerged buildings here, and this brings me to the game design mindset that I've noticed while playing this game. Hades is a game of substance. It isn't just about selling a gameplay component by making it really compelling to its players. Rather, it's often about going one step further to just blow your mind away with the creativity and commitment the developers have for this game. And this is by no means a principle that applies only to the game's visual design, but this is where I noticed it first. Let's take a look at Asphodel, the second region of the underworld. In Greek mythology, Asphodel is a meadow. It's the in-between afterlife plane where mortals that were neither wicked or valorous are sent to. Hades turns this concept completely upside down because it wants to make this area more exciting. Asphodel is still the afterlife area where neutral souls are sent to, and it was supposedly just a meadow, but at some point it was flooded by the infernal Phlegethon River, turning it into this fiery hellscape. And the developers went ham on this creative twist by making visuals that are extraordinary. Fun fact, it's actually the only area that you navigate through rafts as opposed to doors, and that's because only a handful of areas remain above the fiery lake of lava. And because of it, there's a slew of submerged structures like gravestones, hands of drowned shades reaching out, and innocent denizens immortalized as skeletons desperately trying to crawl out of the I mean, even reading this back is just overwhelming. Okay, I'm joking, I just actually run out of air. I'm a professional, I promise. But you get the idea. Visually, it's a lot. And it's a lot in the best way possible. I didn't previously know of Asphodel in Greek mythology, but once I learned that it was just a peaceful meadow that is now overflowing with lava in the context of the game, I couldn't help it but feel for these unfortunate souls trapped within. This is the sort of effect that Hades' design mindset of just going one step further achieves. Asphodel is not only turned into a compelling area gameplay-wise, but its set pieces also tell a tragic story. It's not really a story you can interact with, you cannot do anything to fix the effects of the flood. So technically, while it's all just fluff, it helps make the world of Hades that much more vibrant. Going forward, I'd actually challenge you to look out for how this design mindset is used, because it's what elevates Hades as an experience. It's a methodology that I would not only applaud, but actively encourage you looking at, because it's the stuff great games are made of. Now before we move on, there's two more areas to talk about, so let's do that in brief. There's Elysium, a region that features lush and verdant overgrowths with many motifs of war and valor, and that's because it's a plane reserved mainly for fortitudinous warriors. It's a sort of area that really pops because of how contrasting it is compared to the other areas. And I really like the effect they made for the Lethe River, this sort of flowy mist that permeates the grounds below. What actually sets this area apart is the enemies you encounter. There's these warrior shades that use swords, shields, bows, and spears. They're called the Exalted, and when they die, they drop their weapons and transform into this sort of wispy thing. The wisps don't actually pose any threat to you, but they will try to get to any weapon and rearm themselves, essentially respawning their exalted form. And by that I mean that they can go to any weapon, not just their own, and rearm themselves with whichever weapon they find. A smart way to give this area a unique twist gameplay-wise. Then lastly, we also have the Temple of Styx, which is loosely based on the idea of the Styx River being the titular way of transporting the recently dead to the Underworld. Now the temple itself, I'd say, is the least remarkable place from a visual perspective, which is not to say that it looks bad, but I like it much more from a gameplay perspective rather than a visual one. You see, instead of being a linear region, the temple's gimmick is that there are 5 routes you can follow. Each route is a series of smaller rooms culminating in a difficult encounter, or a satyr sack that you can give to Cerberus to allow you to the surface and to the final boss. And each time Cerberus leaves, you get a witty and different message about it. And if you have some spare gold, Charon is also here to sell you some stuff. Overall, the temple is a well thought out level, because it changes the pacing by playing around with the standard run progression, a smart twist on your own gameplay. Of course, you also have the outside world, and even though it's really small, there's something magical about the snowy environment and the reflections of the water and the sunrise. Apart from the environment, the character design is also really beautiful. Stylistically, it's really detailed and somewhat of a realistic comic book mix-up. Each character design is dripped in mythological flair. Poseidon's hair is wavy like the sea, Zeus's beard resembles the clouds, Aphrodite is... well, she's naked. They are beautifully drawn, and some design choices are quite particular. Hades' beard, for instance, is groomed in the style of his insignia, and the same detail is found in the design of his spear. Nyx's hair resembles the night sky, Hypno's cloak is actually a chair, and the thing he wears on his forehead is a sleeping mask. All of these design details are as purposeful as they're beautiful. But definitely my favorite design is that of Chaos. I mean, just look at it, it's so imposing and mysterious. Look at all these beings forming out of them, a nod to them being the primordial being, with beautiful red flowers, and they even hold a small earth globe in their hand. It's cosmically sublime, and definitely a testament to the game's art department skill. So now that we've discussed these environments, let's actually talk about what you'll be doing in them. And let me say right off the bat, the combat components are fantastic. It's fast-paced, it's responsive, and it often feels overwhelming, but never in a bad way. If we look at the basis of combat, you of course have your default weapon moveset, but the cool thing is how it and the enemies interact with the stage. Because the components of a stage are not just there to look good, but rather have very specific roles in combat as well. For instance, any piece of geometry with collision can be used to slam enemies in for bonus damage. And that's not all. Across stages you'll find pillars, statues and such that once hit will cause debris to fall nearby. You as the player cannot be hit by this debris, but your enemies can, and that's great. You never have to be wary about these pieces of scenery because they can only benefit you. And because you don't have to be careful about it, the game maintains its hectic gameplay all the while the stage itself reacts to the destruction you cause. This is the effect the gameplay achieves as a microcosm. If we want to take a look on a macrocosm level, then we absolutely have to talk about boons and the gameplay variety they bring. From a canonical standpoint, the gods of Olympus have heard Zagreus' wishes to escape the Underworld, and because he's family, they desire to help him out by giving him the opportunity to encounter their boons. There's 9 gods that lend their aid, with each of their boons providing bonuses based on their mastery over aspects of the world. For instance, Poseidon, as the god of the sea, has boons that knock back enemies, so it's easier to make use of the game's wall slam mechanics. Zeus can produce bolts that chain to nearby enemies, Demeter slows enemies, Dionysus has thighs that could literally choke me daddy. He has a special hangover effect, which is like a poison, damage over time debuff. And each of these gods have different such unique effects. I won't be going over each and every such effect, especially because, as we've discussed before, the game has a tendency to go one step further. And this most certainly affects the principle of boons in many ways as well. For instance, bonuses from gods can get a secondary effect. Poseidon's rapture effect enhances knockbacks so that enemies receive damage if they move. And Zeus's jolt effect makes enemies struck by lightning to take additional damage if they attack. Artemis's boons are centered around giving attacks a chance to be critical, which inflicts triple the amount of damage.
Nice.
But her secondary effect makes it so that after one critical attack occurs, another enemy is marked and has an increased chance of receiving critical damage. What I'm trying to say is that there's a real range to all of these effects and bonus effects. And even though I promised I won't be going through each god's specifics, I find it genuinely hard to stick to that. Now, when I mentioned specifically that Zagreus' moveset includes attacks, specials, casts, and dodges, it's because each of these components interact with boons individually. A god's boon can be applied to any of these components. And aside from getting passives, each of these gets a visual effect to match the god, while casts are changed completely. You can have Aphrodite's blessing on your normal attacks and Ares' on your special, or you can have the same god's blessing on all of them and take full advantage of their primary and secondary bonuses. There is, however, a good reason to try and diversify them though, and that's because of dual boons, synergetic bonuses that empower one another. One of my favorites happens to be between the aforementioned Aphrodite and Ares. Aphrodite's debuff reduces enemy damage by 40%, while Ares inflicts Doom, which is a status effect that can be applied once and will deal damage after a short few seconds. This duo boon makes it so that the Doom effect is reapplied automatically as long as the enemy is weakened, which is a really great thing to have if you want to focus on a singular enemy without switching between attacks. That's how deep this boon system can go, and yet it goes a level deeper, because there's also calls, which are like ultimate abilities of sorts. I didn't get access to them till a few runs in, so the game allowed me to get used to these slew of mechanics first. But when you gain access to them, the game opens up a new combat consideration for you. This is what I mean that the game's components often overwhelm you. It's not something that I say just from a combat perspective, but also because all of these combat options open up to you, to which calls are but one of many. Now the calls themselves are, again, unique per god. Poseidon makes you invulnerable as you ride a wave, Demeter creates vortexes of snow that expand and slow enemies, but a really cool one is Aphrodite's. As the goddess of love, her call naturally entrances a mob and makes them fight for you for a short few seconds. And it's nothing to scoff at. A charmed enemy is genuinely capable of destroying hordes of mobs with ease. And this call system is also a combat-specific sort of resource management. If you look under your health bar, you'll see that there's another bar split into 4 segments that fills up as you deal or receive damage. You can use a call once a segment is full, or you can wait till it's fully charged, at which point you use all of it and get an enhanced version of the call. There's just so many options, so many build possibilities that this game intrigued me from the start. That's what this game does best on a macrocosm. It's about discovering synergies and builds, then thinking tactically about what to choose in consideration with what you have and what you may come across. It's a beautiful discovery process that becomes a mental exercise in forward planning, and I cannot sing it praises enough. In fact, do you remember the passive bonuses you get from the mirror, the ones you unlock with darkness? Well, even that is not as straightforward a system as it seems, because early on you'll find that you can actually switch between two sets of passives, and you're at full liberty to mix and match them with alternative passives however you wish, which can just completely change your playstyle or how you interact with boons or many other gameplay elements. This screen in particular just looks like a puzzle that opens up so many gameplay intricacies. So, is this it about combat? No. I mentioned earlier that Zagreus starts out with Stygius, the Blade of the Underworld. And that's because there's 5 other weapons you can choose from, all of them unique, all of them with completely different mechanics, and all of them equally viable. You know what, let's go on a tangent. As a fun exercise, if you've played Hades, tell me how many times you've asked yourself, is this it? Only for the game to hit you with something new, like a new combat mechanic, a new goal, or even an entire new way of playing the game. I have honestly lost count and just marveled at how the game has the nerve to subvert my expectations time after time. And for a game to be able to do that over and over again, hats off. Hats off to you. If you haven't played the game and want to partake in this fun exercise, just play the game? At this point, if you're still watching and haven't played Hades, you're doing yourself a disservice. You should not be listening to me explaining all of these amazing features and instead experience them yourself. Come back afterwards though, preferably with some friends. It helps with the viewership. Let's go back to the weapons. With keys, you can unlock the rest of them, like Verata, the Eternal Spear, a weapon with really good range and a special that throws and recalls a spear in a way that is sure to make you feel cool. You have the Shield of Chaos, a really cool gimmicky weapon that is unique in its ability to shield you. And you can also pretend you're Captain America now that Marvel's Avengers is shutting down. Then there's also Coronarched, the heart-seeking bow, which is, well, it's a bow, it's what you'd expect from a ranged option. There's also the Twin Fists, a very close-range weapon which focuses on dealing blows in really fast succession. The last weapon you can get is a gun. Jokes aside, it's a really unique ranged weapon that deals damage in quick bursts and has a special that throws a grenade. I was blown away not just by how unique these are between them, but also because they work with the boons you encounter to create a myriad of amazing build possibilities. One of my favorite debuffs is actually from the thick-thighed Dionysus. His hangover damage over time, along with Demeter's chill, is unique in the sense that it can be stacked for a stronger effect. But I never felt that a weapon like, say, the sword or the shield is fast enough to really capitalize on it. And that's until I found the Exograph, the gun, because this is actually ideal for it. It's so fast, you can easily get a full stack of 5 in just about a second. And this is really just an example that I hope puts into perspective how many options the game opens up to you, while also engaging you to think about the most ideal use with your weapon of choice. Alright, now that I've introduced the weapons, it's that part of the video where I tell you that the game doesn't stop there. Aside from the regular stuff you encounter in your runs, you may also find dataless hammers, tools left around by the architect of the Underworld. They are different from boons because they don't just give a flat out bonus as much as they can change the weapon entirely. There is so much fun to be had in the prospect of changing a weapon's functionality, and the game really explores this. From simple things like increased range or double hits to turning the railgun into a shotgun or making it launch 5 grenades, Hades does it all. And its commitment to these changes in the boon system is absolute, because everything will work exactly how you expect it to work with no compromise whatsoever. Just because a build and a weapon modification can really break the game's balance, the game never penalizes you for it, it fully embraces it and lets you have fun with it. Hades is just a really great example of giving the players full agency to make crazy choices. I mean, look at this, Artemis has a boon that automatically shoots an arrow with each successful hit you deal, and the result is an absolute chaos happening everywhere. It's honestly a really great system, and I've had an absolute blast interacting with it. By the way, I noticed a really neat bit of functionality when using the grenades, which is that the game has a rather comprehensive collision and physics system in place. It's not just about grenades bouncing off walls, but you might have noticed that not all pieces of geometry serve as hard walls. There's desks, coffins, and other such things that obviously don't extend high up like pillars do. And the game accounts for that, because you may not traverse over them, but you can shoot projectiles like grenades or even arrows over them. Those are the 2 pieces of geometry maps have. Or so I thought. In using the hexagraph, I noticed that some objects are actually in between the two, because arrows would not go over them while grenades would. But that's not all, the distance from which I was launching would also give different results. So if I were to stand too close, the grenades would bounce off, as if it didn't get enough height. And that is when it struck me that the game actually accounts for the height of a projectile. It's not just visual fluff, these are genuine real-time calculations the game makes to determine whether something would actually go over an object or not. It's such a small detail, but it perfectly demonstrates the depth these developers went through when creating their environment and considering how the combat plays around it. An astounding amount of detail and commitment to what is otherwise just a gameplay technicality. Alright, at this point I'm about 4 pages in talking exclusively about combat, so we should move on to something else. Except that we're not going to do that, because there is more. After you unlock every weapon, your next return to the House of Hades introduces an entirely new layer of gameplay possibilities. And that's because each weapon has 4 aspects. The first are the defaults, but the next 2 feature a gimmick that changes the way you use a weapon. I'm hesitant to say that they're new weapons entirely, but they come pretty damn close to it. And each of these have different appearances and even an upgrade system that makes them more powerful. Among my favorites are the spear's aspect of Achilles, which allows you to instantly rush towards where you throw your spear and empowers your next few attacks. Then there's also the fist's aspect of Demeter, which empower your special to hit several times after landing 12 normal attacks. But definitely my personal favorite is the bow's aspect of Chiron, which marks enemies with normal attacks and causes your special to fire arrows that seek your target. It's really cool visually and a fun weapon to play around with, because you can make trick shots and land backstabbing attacks even though an enemy faces you. Wait, hold on, I've talked about the combat system for around 12 minutes and I haven't even talked about backstabbing? Oh, there's just so much. And I'm not even done talking about weapon aspects yet, because each weapon has a 4th hidden aspect that isn't available from the get-go, but changes the weapon entirely. These hidden aspects are genuinely just completely different weapons, from moveset to effects to everything, including some upgrades you can get through the Daedalus hammer. And what I like about them is that from a lore perspective, they're actually detached from Greek mythology. You have the Excalibur from Arthurian legends, the Bow of Rama from Hinduism, and even Lucifer's own railgun, all with descriptions about who it belongs to or even will belong to in the future, adding an air of mystique about the entire world Hades is set in. For a game to achieve this much versatility with its combat system is just jaw-dropping. I'll never be able to look at a game again and say, oh, this game has different weapons, that's nice, there's some replayability to it. Because Hades showed me the full extent of what's possible. Whenever mentions of each run being different will come up, I'll always think about Hades, because Hades really embodies that ideal like no other game. I'm going to stop focusing on combat for now, because I've talked at length about how it has subverted my expectations just time and time again. And because of that, I haven't really let the game shine in terms of some of the other length it goes to make each run different. Let's talk about bosses. Each region has one at the end. You have Megara guarding Tartarus, the Bone Hydra for Asphodel, King Theseus and Asterius the Minotaur for Elysium, and finally Hades. The penultimate ones in particular were really intimidating. I guess that as the only duo boss fight in the game, it might have some memories. But it's another cool instance of how Hades plays around with Greek mythology. One of the most famous exploits of Theseus was slaying the Minotaur inside of the labyrinth, and the developers built on that idea. There's not a lot, if any, tales about what happened to them both after their deaths. So they created the story that both of them, being great warriors, ended up in Elysium and created a bond of camaraderie. Hell, they were even able to give Asterius a compelling, calm, and respectful personality, and he's just a minotaur, a beast that hardly gets any characterization outside of being a monster that required sacrifices. And these two would go on to become the champions of the realm as you fight them in the Elysium Colosseum. And I just want to go on a short tangent about how even the arena itself has some personality to it. I mean, there are these pillars and shades that spectate the fight from it, and if you hit these pillars they react. And if that's not enough, the entire arena audibly reacts and visually emotes to the fight. It has a lot of details that makes this one stage more alive than it has any right to be. Right, back to Subverting Expectations. In my early attempts, I found Elysium to be rather difficult. It was essentially my run killer, and I was getting to a point where I felt pretty confident about navigating the other two areas. So I was approaching the end of Tartarus and getting ready for another confrontation with Megara, when this happened.
Nice to meet you.
murderer.
This was my earliest cue to understand that the game did not come to play. You see, Megara is only one of the three Furies, with the others being Tisiphone and Alecto, and the game not only recognizes this aspect of Greek mythology, but actually includes them as bosses that can replace Megara. I wouldn't go as far as to say that they're completely unique, but they do have some differences in their movesets and gimmicks. Tisiphone makes the playable area smaller and smaller with each third of her HP, while Alecto has a rage meter that once filled makes her get really aggressive with her attacks. Even Zagreus gets in on the fun and starts guessing every time which one of the three Furies will it be. And it's a principle that carries over to the Bone Hydra as well, since it changes appearances and abilities, and even though it doesn't have a personality, it still makes each run exciting, which is what Hades does best. The last two bosses don't really get anything new outside of one or two new moves, but you know what, I'm okay with that, because what the game offers is already very compelling. And by the way, it offers even more. Foreshadowing. Apart from these encounters, there's also mini-bosses, which are sort of like amped up normal mobs, so I don't think it's all that necessary that we go over them, except for one. If we go back to Elysium, you'll find that Asterius can be encountered alone. His moveset is essentially the same, but the cool thing about this encounter is that it has consequences. If you fought Asterius individually in the same run, you'll see that he does not have a full health bar when you fight him along with Theseus, which is again a really small but neat detail. But it also plays in the overall relationship between these three characters. Asterius gains a lot of respect for Zagreus, while Theseus is overly cocky and openly hostile to him. And the writers use this to create some funny friction between them. I mean, for as cocky as Theseus is, he's also quite insecure, and that's the tea.
I really don't see why Asterius puts up with you.
I feel very attacked!
But in fact, there's a lot of really cool interactions with each boss, because the writers really went all out in making these characters have vibrant personalities and relationships. Even the Bone Hydra gets a bit of personality, with Zagreus starting to call it learning, and from that point onwards, the game changes the name displayed during the fight. It's subtle, but meaningful touches is what Hades serves you for breakfast. You of course also have the final boss fight with Hades, and since Zagreus is his son, the writers created a range of interactions to really explore their relationship. But let's talk about that later and focus instead on what happens for the very first time you escape the Underworld. Throughout your time in the House of Hades, you will have found out that Zagreus' real mother isn't Nyx as he thought. In fact, it's the canonical queen of the Underworld, Persephone, who is missing, and she left shortly after giving birth to Zagreus. And this piece of information motivates him more than ever to escape the Underworld and find her. Luckily, once you escape for the first time and reach Greece, Zagreus finds his mother nearby tending to her cottage and garden. They finally have a first chance to connect, with Persephone revealing that she didn't even know that Zagreus was alive, because he was stillborn. But before too long, the game pulls a Greek tragedy twist.
Oh, it's... guess I'm just a little tired, that's all.
No. No, that isn't it. It's that... you cannot stay here. The fates are cruel, Zagreus. You're bound to that place. Same as your father.
No, I can come back. I can come back. Now that I found you. However long it takes.
It turns out that even though Zagreus can escape the Underworld, he cannot reside within the realm of mortals for too long before being forcefully beckoned back to the House of Hades. When Hades kept taunting his own son about there being no escape from the Underworld, he wasn't lying. Zagreus genuinely does not belong on the surface and is fated to never be able to stay there for long. It really is a classic Greek tragedy, because no matter the effort, Zagreus may never escape. But therein lies another facet of the game's brilliant writing. In discovering Persephone, Zagreus' goal changes. It's no longer about escaping, but about besting the Underworld's finest so that they may get a chance to talk. Which is smart, because this tragic twist, while impactful, doesn't undermine the adventure or the gameplay loop itself. But besides your goal changing, you will also encounter something new before you start your next escape attempt.
Looks like Father's changed the terms of our relationship.
When I first opened this, I was yet again at a loss for words. The Pact of Punishment feels like an entirely new facet of gameplay opening up right before your very eyes. It's essentially a list of modifiers and you have full control of it to change your runs as you please. I would say that on a technical level, it is an optional feature, but if you want to take full advantage of Hades' story and experience, you'll be making full use of it. That's because each modifier increases your bounty by at least 1 level. Now, why is that important? Well, you might have noticed that every time you defeat a boss with a new weapon, you get one of the rarer resources. Titan's Blood unlocks and upgrades weapon aspects, diamonds are used to carry out special construction orders, and ambrosia is used to deepen Zagreus' relationships with other characters. Your problem though will be that these resources cannot be reacquired by slaying the same boss with the same weapons. And here's where bounties come into play. Each new bounty level with each separate weapon, but not weapon aspect, will give you the opportunity to get these rare resources if you can best the bosses with these new rules. Now sure, you can also buy them from Charon at the Temple of Styx, but they are very expensive and appear at random, which is not ideal and will take much more time. So you are encouraged to make full use of this new mechanic. The modifiers themselves range from simple stuff like increased damage or more mobs, to things that can really turn a run on its head, like limiting the number of options you have on boons or hammers, or giving armored mobs up to 2 extra abilities, or even adding a timer.
Run's dead.
By far though, my favorite is the extreme measures condition. It actually increases bounty exponentially, so you know it's good. But it's essentially yet another way to make your runs unique. Initially, you'll be able to add 3 stacks, 1 per each boss, from Tartarus to Elysium, making these encounters drastically different. The main Fury you fight in Tartarus may now be joined by all of her sisters. It doesn't turn it into a triple boss fight, you still have 1 sister you have to take down, but the other 2 will join in with their own attacks. So if you ever thought that Tisiphone's room gimmick made everything claustrophobic, just you wait till her sisters join in. Next up is the Bone Serpent, and the thing about it is that by default, it's actually quite easy. The main head has a very limited range and it's stuck in this upper part of the area, so there's plenty of opportunities to play it safe. The moments of intensity though come with each third of its HP that you take off, because several smaller hydras appear while the main one becomes invulnerable. This is an instance of the gameplay becoming overwhelming but not unmanageable. It really is an adrenaline rush. Undoubtedly the highest points of this boss fight as you struggle managing each small hydra and what they do, which is made more difficult because they can each be of different individual types. The extreme measure of this encounter changes the area so that it's made of smaller islands with the hydra in the middle. This simple placement change nearly eliminates all safe areas and challenges you to become more aware of your movements. Apart from that, the hydra gains the ability to move anywhere it wants once it reaches the last third of its HP. So this modifier essentially takes away the flaws of the default encounter while making it a harder and more engaging boss fight. But how this condition modifies the Elysium duo is amazing. They both change looks, Asterius gains some new attacks, but Theseus gains a chariot, and he just joyrides away dropping bombs and shooting at you. In fact, one of Theseus' gimmicks is that his shield blocks any attack that faces him. In his chariot, this is no longer the case, but you do eventually destroy it, and from there it's business as usual. Though, what I like even more about this system is that characters actually react to it within the game. It's essentially a canonized feature. If you find Megara in the lounge back at the hub, she'll react to you gaining access to the Pact of Punishment and be very much against using the extreme measures condition, and that's because she actually doesn't want to be reunited with her sisters. Theseus and Asterius also react to their new gear, while Achilles makes fun of Theseus, asking Zagreus if he decided to wear a ridiculous mask made by Daedalus to mock him, which he does. And this all relates to how the writing itself also subverts expectations. Features such as these pact modifiers, I feel, would usually go on without much elaboration and lore, but Hades does go that one step ahead, and it even leads to some deeper interactions with certain characters. This is just a taste of how interconnected the writing gets with the gameplay. Now, for the sake of completeness, let's also go over Hades' boss fight. And to be fair, as the final boss fight, I'd argue that is one of the more difficult ones. Hades has a moveset that has quite a bit of range and really punishes you if you get too reckless, but he's unique in the sense that he's the only boss you have to defeat twice. The first time around he'll summon random enemies, while the second time he uses jar traps and moves that make the entire map a minefield. So it's an interesting case of using the same moveset but in different contexts. A detail I really appreciate though is in the music. When Hades goes down and powers up for the second phase, the interregnum has the music calm down, before spiking back up to tell you that shit is about to get real.
But we are not finished here yet. You asked for this.
I really love it when games play around with their soundtracks like that. It's a detail that really resonated because I like it when games sync their soundtrack to command a certain feel during gameplay. But in the context of extreme measures, Hades is not eligible for it. At least not at first. Eventually though, you'll be able to unlock it from the house contractor. And it gets wild. His moveset is enhanced, but what makes this first phase really hard is that the normal mobs he would spawn are replaced with mini-bosses instead. You can't just easily dispatch them or just ignore them. There is simply a new wall of combat considerations you have to prepare for. And his second phase doesn't get any easier. Cerberus makes an appearance, who's a good boy, but he also gains the ability to regenerate health from the jars that trap you. And this is a smart way to increase difficulty. In the standard boss fight, you can pretty much avoid jars by cleaning up a few of them or through smart positioning, but now you have to remember where they are, otherwise Hades will just regenerate a huge amount of health, but eventually you'll be able to take him down for a second time and think you're done.
No, I'm not finished with you yet.
That's right, Extreme Measures gives Hades yet another phase. It's for the most part the same as his second phase with a few key differences. First, there's a filter that darkens the screen, and second, jars are spawned passively. So if you thought that Hades regenerating health was a problem, just get a load of this. It really is one of the hardest trials of the game, and it was as challenging as it was engaging.
I went all out, and still...
Speaking of final challenges, the game has another curveball for you. At some point, returning to the hub, you'll see 3 covered statues commissioned by Skelly. To uncover them, he challenges you to complete runs at different bounty levels. The first 2 are unlocked at 8 and 16 respectively, and they both have trophies attached to them, so naturally I did them. But the last one has a requirement of a bounty of level 32 and no trophy attached to it. Now, the way I approach games is that I usually just experience a piece of media as a trophy completionist, so I'll be honest in saying that I didn't originally intend to go for it. But the more I played Hades, the more I opened up to the idea. The game was simply so engaging that I didn't just become willing to experience the challenge, but actually craved it. And this right here is the mark of a good game. A game that subverts even to what extent you're willing to engage with it. Because Hades didn't just meet me halfway with what I expected from a game, it tramped all over that mark and engaged me to a level far above what I expected it to engage me, and in turn I felt completely compelled to engage with it back. Whether we are talking about a 32 bounty run or Hades' own Extreme Measures boss fight, these are some of the hardest challenges, completely optional things, and Hades made me want to experience them. Take note, because this is what great games do. Now that I've talked at length about Hades' combat and adjacent mechanics, I'd say we have a chat about the characters that permeate its world. And let me start off with another challenge for you. Tell me if there's any one character in this entire game that is one-dimensional or not clearly developed with the writer's effort and dedication. And no, Karen doesn't count. I mean, he doesn't really speak, so that would be rude. But I put it to you that there's no such character that you'll find. Any being you interact with has loads of personality, and that includes bosses. I already mentioned how the writers managed to give Asterius a distinct personality, but his confidant, Theseus, is written in such a way that he's not just one-dimensionally arrogant, but there's loads of text and voice acting to showcase it. As another example, Tisiphone is a character that doesn't have a wide vocabulary, but even then she says murderer with different intonations as if to try and convey thought. She still receives characterization indirectly from Megara, saying that she often punishes murderers and such, so her work might have affected her mentally to an extreme level. And these are some of the more subtle things. The characters within the House of Hades are way more detailed and implicated in the story. You've got Nyx, who turns out to be an adoptive mother to Zagreus, and the writers really managed to convey the sort of bond they have of mutual compassion and familial relationship. I mean, at some point Nyx even comments on whether Zagreus finds it acceptable to refer to him as her own child, considering that he knows the truth about Persephone. And Zagreus finds this bond between them to be so close and personal that he'd gladly have her refer to him as her own child still. This is how emotionally deep these interactions can go. Another favorite of mine is Achilles, a mythological figure known for his fortitude in war. I imagined him to be a sort of boastful and arrogant character, but no, he's calm and introspective and even regrets his past as a warrior. In fact, he's not in Elysium as you might have expected. Instead, he works under the service of the house, being a tutor to Zagreus. He's another character that has a rather ambiguous death and after-death lore, and the writers had the idea to build on that by also expanding on another. His companion Patroclus is often thought to have had either a bond of camaraderie or romance with him, and they decided to expand on the idea that they were lovers. That's right, Hades is a woke game. Jokes aside, you actually meet Patroclus and Elysium and act as a messenger between them, and the game reveals how nuanced their characters and relationship were. Let me actually squeeze in a relevant tangent. Early on, Achilles will give Zagreus a codex, a book that recorded all of Achilles' knowledge on gods, monsters, weapons, items, basically anything you might encounter or use. But as Zagreus, you have to relearn some of this information by, say, having X amounts of conversations with a character or slaying something several times. It's a neat little tool because it also keeps track of your relationships with characters. It's so well thought out, in fact, that the codex opens immediately on the entry of the character you're closest to. But the thing that I liked about it is that when you encounter Patroclus in Elysium for the first few times, you won't actually know who he is. He's this mysterious and downtrodden person that is not all that open to conversation. But if you check your codex afterwards, you'll find an entry for him with his actual name, since Achilles knew him. And Zagreus reacts to finding out his name while the game does as well, because from there on out, his name is going to be displayed properly despite him never introducing himself. And there's a few other neat interactions as well, like Zagreus being believed to be the god of blood, prompting him to ask Achilles about it. For a game component like this to have such interactions that extend to characters is just ingenious. It goes to show the dedication the writers and developers had to make every piece of this game, no matter how small, alive and breathing. Now let's go back to the characters and talk about bonds. Pretty much every character you can talk to, with the exception of most bosses, is a part of a broader relationship system. When being prompted to talk to a character, you may give them a bottle of nectar you have collected, which raises your affinity with them. This is a system that opens the way for you to have even deeper conversations with every character, while also having some gameplay implications. Gifting a nectar bottle for the first time will have each of them provide you with a trinket, even those will become available later, like Persephone and Hades. You may have only one equipped, but they provide you with some neat passives. Trinkets from the gods of Olympus usually guarantee that you find boons of that specific god, so it can be a strategic choice in creating your build early on. Other trinkets increase health, give you some gold, or increase your damage output for each encounter you complete without taking damage. There's a wide variety of bonuses, and the more you use them, the better they become. And they are also breathing components, because characters react to them constantly. In fact, having Achilles' trinket when talking to Patroclus is another way to get him to reveal his identity. And there's loads of such interactions. Chaos asks you to use his trinket when you fight Hades, not because it's useful in any way, but just for a laugh. And this genuinely becomes an optional objective in your list of prophecies. Then you also have Hades' own trinket, which gives you his unique disappearance ability as a call, and using it while fighting him makes him genuinely irritated.
Father! Vanish, see if I'm here.
Now the smart thing about these trinkets is that the devs made it so that you get them the first time you gift nectar, and it's a compelling way to introduce this affinity system and get yourself more familiar with these characters. Subsequent gifts don't award anything material except for 6 characters, but for all of them you'll eventually have to complete a favor, a secondary objective of sorts which is represented by this locked heart. Favors are essentially side stories you can engage with, though fulfilling them is rather ambiguous. The earliest one I encountered was between Nyx and Chaos, and it was this cool storyline about a primordial being wanting to reconnect with their daughter. It's really expensive to complete as a side objective, costing just above 3000 darkness, but after you pay for it, Nyx will appear occasionally in Chaos's rooms and talk to you there. So characters like her do move around to give you the impression that the world reacts to your actions, that characters are more than just 3D models with walls of text. But undoubtedly, my favorite side quests are related to the characters you find in your runs. To elaborate, there are special encounters you may come across, one in Tartarus, one in Asphodel, and one in Elysium. Tartarus has Sisyphus, who gives you either HP, gold, or darkness. Asphodel has Eurydice, who can upgrade your boons, and Elysium has Patroclus, and he in particular is amazing, because he can fully restore every single one of your second chance charges. He is genuinely a run saver. But aside from that, each of these characters have an engaging storyline you can follow based on their predicament. Let's start with Patroclus, since I I've already talked quite a bit about him. You eventually find out that the reason Achilles cannot join him is because he signed a contract with Hades. In exchange to his eternal service to the house, he'll allow Patroclus to reside in Elysium. But Patroclus is clearly unhappy about it, being basically the only shade not to attack you in that entire realm. Once you advance in both his and Achilles' story, you'll have a secondary objective in reuniting them. You'll have to gain access to the administrative chamber, which by itself has some neat things inside, but it's used in many of these side quests to find contracts and change or nullify them, to which Nyx always helps Zagreus in locating them. In fact, it's a testament to these interactions that Nyx helps in breaking contracts. She shows her compassionate nature in understanding that these agreements may have been needlessly harsh. This is how you free Achilles and let him return to his lover in Elysium. And even though he doesn't have to, he still returns to the house every now and then. Patroclus just as well changes in his conversations, even down to his posture, as he now stands proudly by his lover. It's not really an example of character growth as much as it is another facet of his personality being revealed by her actions. Moving on to Eurydice, I'm sure just about all of us know about the Greek tragedy between her and Orpheus. In Hades, they're now separated eternally, with Orpheus being the court musician. Except that he's so depressed without his muse that he actually refuses to play any song, much to Hades' frustration.
Play us a song already, or else next time I'll not be quite so charitable with your punishment.
And Eurydice herself is actually quite resentful towards him, since he went through all the effort of rescuing her from the underworld only to fail at the end. Nonetheless, you start becoming a messenger between the two, and just as before, eventually get the opportunity to reunite them. And it's such a cool change in dynamic, because Eurydice always sang along in our encounters, but when Orpheus visits, they sing together. And I really like that, not just because singing for them is like their own language, but also because some of the best soundtracks in this game feature them as singers. Then we have Sisyphus, who is known in mythology to have angered the gods by tricking them repeatedly, and his predicament is to push a boulder that is fated to always roll back down. To be honest, I found it very surprising how he is such a soft-spoken character and how he's quite content with his punishment. He even made the boulder a friend of sorts. It's an inanimate companion to which he speaks to. He even encourages you to try speaking to Boldy, as he calls it, which you can actually do. You can give Boldy nectar the same way you would to any other being, though I hesitate to call it a fully fledged character since, you know, he's just a boulder with a big smiley face, which is a nice detail, but it's a really endearing interaction to make available considering Sisyphus' character. Now, he never asks to be released, even though Zagreus raises the prospect, but either way it becomes a favor that you can perform for him, and once you do, nothing changes. Sisyphus will stay in the same room. But this is not to say that the writing is lackluster. Rather, he explains that he's grown fond of this place, and he finds it hard to take Boldy with him if he's to leave. In fact, if you've paid attention, you'll see that the writers went through the effort of making everything cohesive and sensible to the logic of this world and setting. A sleeper tidbit that I found is that Nyx details to Zagreus how he has access to all of his weapons, to which even Hades acts surprised at times when you confront him on the surface. And Nyx reveals that she used her cloaking powers to mask Achilles' actions and have him steal weapons for Zagreus. It was a question I never really asked, but it was an eye-opener to the fine attention to detail these writers have. You will have probably noticed that back when Zagreus escaped for the first time, even though the tragic twist fates him to never be able to leave, he still has a reason to escape since he wants to see his mother. But after the 10th escape, Persephone returns with you back home. And it's a really beautiful sequence with fantastic music. I mean, if you've heard of Bastion, you'll have probably expected it. Anyway, at this point there's not much of a reason for you to try and escape. But because the game's logic is built around that loop, you're given a new justification. You're now responsible for testing the Underworld's measures against those who want to escape. And it's not just a simple text explaining it, it's an entirely new function you fulfill in the service of the house, to which every character reacts to. Megara and Thanatos in particular will have lines that reference you as working together as colleagues. But what I liked even more is how the relationship between Hades and Zagreus changes completely through this narrative device. It feels like an entirely new dynamic, and it was a joy to experience both of them working through their struggles with each other while gaining a newfound respect when they fight. Either way, this does not mark the end of the story. One of the problems about Persephone is that Hades fancied her and requested Zeus' aid, who, as mythological lore goes, actually kidnapped her. Persephone doesn't actually mind this, but the entire situation is a problem as none of the other gods of Olympus know of this. Hades fears that this could cause an all-out war between the Underworld and Olympus, which in all fairness does make sense. The gods are, after all, known to have a quick temper. You'll have most likely have felt that yourself in rooms that feature two boons. The gods will get angry just by choosing one's favor over the other.
I have to laugh. I'm sorry. This is so ridiculous. I can't stand him.
Even though these gods have been made to appear a bit more friendly and even goofy, the game implies that a lot of mythological lore still applies to them, in which case they might be genuinely terrible beings. Poseidon might have transformed into a stallion to have his way with Demeter, who turned herself into a mare. Wait, what? So from here, you have to raise your affinity with them while Persephone thinks of a plan to resolve the issue. Personally, I like the fact that they didn't decide to end the game on a cliffhanger and instead committed to a full story. Now, I mentioned that increasing affinity further doesn't provide you with any physical reward, save for 6 specific cases. These are Megara, Thanatos, Dusa, Skelly, Achilles, and Sisyphus. Once you completed their favor and give them a bottle of ambrosia rewarded from defeating the champions of Elysium, they will give you a chthonic companion. It's essentially a new combat mechanic, but it has substantial bearing on gameplay. They resemble toys, which you can use during the runs to summon their owners and aid you with moves you have likely seen before, though 3 of them are completely unique. Once you release Sisyphus, he rewards you by dropping down on your enemies, dealing damage while also dropping a random assortment of darkness, gold, and healing items, though his aim could use some work. Achilles will drop down with Patroclus, dealing massive damage to 2 enemies. But by far my most used one is Skelly. His support is quite unique among your companions because he's not offensive, but rather a piece of utility. Spawning Skelly will taunt enemies to distract them from you completely. He's basically a dummy, which, if you've ever interacted with him, you'll know it's his thing. I usually use him in the fight against Asterius and Theseus because he makes it a breeze to go through, but you do have to be careful because you can still attack him and end his support prematurely. All in all, these companions are incredibly useful and can turn any encounter around, and you can upgrade them too and get more uses of them per run. Unfortunately though, there's no other interaction of note, you just kinda get them and that's it. Except that I'm kidding, this is Hades, have you listened to nothing? Of course, you get your usual reactions from some characters, but there are 2 interactions that I find really noteworthy. There's this sort of secret boss fight you can have against Charon if you borrow from his stash of gold.
Wow, thank you, Charon. Sorry. Wait, why are you brandishing your oar in such a menacing way?
It's not all that hard once you get the hang of his attacks, and you can summon any companion, except for one. Skelly will be a no-show, and this is actually a really subtle piece of storytelling. There's this mystery around Skelly about who employed him to be Zagreus' training dummy. You can eventually find out after bonding with him that he's employed by Charon, so of course he wouldn't help you since he's his employer. But apart from that, there's another instance where you cannot summon any companion at all, which is against Hades himself. And if we look at the previous interaction between Skelly and Charon, it makes sense. Using a companion would actually alert Hades about who is specifically helping him, so they have a reason for their inaction as to avoid punishment. But after your mission to escape becomes a duty, he acknowledges that he knows they've been helping you all along despite them refusing to fight him on the surface, and he gives the authority to engage him if you choose to call upon their aid. I really like how he specifically says authority, giving the entire deal a certain sense of importance. In fact, in other games I feel like such a feature would just go on and be usable without any sort of explanation or consideration for continuity. But Hades, again, goes through the effort of canonizing its features, and I have nothing but respect for it. Before we move on, I personally want to go over one more aspect of the bond system. There's 3 romantic interests you can pursue in the form of Thanatos, Megara, and Dusa. With Thanatos, he has a unique mechanic where he appears randomly in normal encounters, and you both engage in a contest of sorts to see who can kill more shades. In winning, your maximum HP is increased, but that's not what I want to focus on. The thing that has struck me with the writing is that from the very first encounter there is palpable tension between the two. Zagreus gets the shivers when he looks into Thanatos' eyes. Padam padam. A hint of the future romantic interest you may pursue with him. And the same thing also happens with Megara and Dusa, though Dusa's approach is a bit more anime-like, shall we say?
You want to talk to me? Me? Oh, wow. Oh, wow. I have to clean the rafters.
You can pursue whoever you want, and you're not limited to just one partner. I romanced both Thanatos and Megara, and I like how the writers included a bit with both being okay with quote-unquote sharing Zagreus. I mean, they are immortals, so they have more freedom to consummate relationships as they wish, but it's such a neat piece of LGBT representation. You're essentially playing a polyamorous bisexual god who's into disembodied Gorgon heads. Okay, that last part isn't really LGBT, but you get the idea. I had no clue the game would go there, but I really appreciate it all the same. Actually, here's a bit of a historical fun fact for you. Did you know that ancient Greece was pretty gay? It was a significant aspect of social interaction, and they were pretty fluid in terms of sexual orientation. Let's see, Greek men who reached the age of manhood were expected to change from being passive to becoming active? Passive men were ridiculed? Wait, hold on, what's Greece's problem with bottoms? Do they even know the amount of work it takes? You know what, I think that Greece's economical failure is fucking deserved. So, at this point I've been talking about this game for about an hour, and I have a confession to make. Hades broke me. What I mean by this is that I'll never be able to look at a game again within the same genre or even vague gameplay category as Hades and take it at face value. The uncompromising flexibility within its gameplay and commitment to deep storytelling has left such a mark on me that I won't be able to help myself but expect the same fidelity that Hades offers. I remember myself playing The Curse of the Dead Gods and West of Dead, games that basically try to emulate the same roguelike and dungeon crawler gameplay. And even though I wasn't blown away or really all that positive towards them, I was still like, well, there's quite a few weapons and other such gameplay components that make it interesting to engage in multiple runs. But if I would have played Hades before those games, they wouldn't stand a chance. They quite simply do not compare. Their writing is shallow, their replayability loop is stale, and their gameplay is rigid and boring. I just won't be satisfied by the same level of presentation again, because Hades showed me what's possible. One of the most mind-blowing things that this game achieves is a world that never really grows stale. And you might have subconsciously felt that as well, because up until the very end of the game, there's always something that is happening. It's not just characters talking to one another or having their own nuanced perspectives. They just react and interact to anything on every level. For instance, I haven't really talked about how you unlock these hidden aspects that reference outwards from Greek mythology. It's another self-involved process of character interaction where you get quote-unquote activation phrases, and there is a variety in how you get these. You get one from Achilles, you get one from Chaos, even one from your individual interactions with Asterius. But even outside of that, there's so many things any one character can say about anything. Like, after you finish the side story of Orpheus and Eurydice, every character will have something to say about it. And it won't stop there, because Zagreus will also become introspective about him possibly involving himself in something that isn't his business. And again, every character will have something new to say about it.
Reactions. Reactions to reactions.
Reactions to reactions.
Analysis of reactions to reactions of the analysis. It's like crazy.
Hours upon hours of voice acting discussing your weapons, your trinkets, your relationships, your companions, your exploits, your encounters, your escapes, your booms, everything. One of the conversations with Hades on the surface is a joke about how many capes he has, since he always burns one each time you confront him. And later, when you gain access to his room and sneak inside, you'll actually find he has loads of capes in his closet. This is peak writing. This doesn't really do the game any justice now, does it? I mainly wrote that as a joke while intending to show that nothing is really just a one-off or insignificant comment, because the writers use their creative power to take anything, however small, and elevate it. And this remark just felt kind of diminutive to their commitment. Frankly, I don't even think I managed to do it any justice considering the layers it has. Nonetheless, the highest praise I can give it is that this dedication to writing created a world that never grows stale. It's a living, breathing system that is a joy to interact with on every single level, no matter how many times I die and emerge from the very same pool of blood in the House of Hades. If there is a note I think I would end on, it is how Hades isn't a story about trying to escape the underworld or reuniting with a loved one or even bringing them back home. It's a story about a broken family of gods and one's effort to bring them back together and make everything right. It's the grandest subversion of my expectations in a game that has blown me away at each and every opportunity it had. It's a genuine labor of love and I completely understand why people want a sequel to it. In fact, it's been a really long time since a game has gotten me engaged for a sequel. Hell, it's been a long time since a game has been able to actively stay on my mind when I could not play it. I was always looking forward to continuing my run or starting a new one when I was working or just went out and about. When I said at the very start of this video that the Underworld of Hades is one that I never wanted to escape, this is what I was building up to. I was dreading the moment when I would inevitably finish it and be out of content I'd find engaging. And that is what a great game does. It makes you fear the very idea of finishing it. So, does Hades have the perfect sauce? Yes, and I'll be taking no further questions about it, because even now, at the very end of the video, I'm at a risk of ranting on yet another tangent. Like, I really feel like talking about fishing, which I was really surprised to see as a feature, but it's neat because you can exchange fishes for rewards and characters react to you catching them and... No. This is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching. If you've enjoyed this breakdown, please do help it in the algorithm by liking, subscribing, sharing, commenting, and doing all the good stuff. So thanks again, and see you next time.